Something is happening in the global economy that the mainstream media is not prepared to explain to you. As we enter the final days of 2025 and look toward 2026, we are witnessing the collapse of a 30-year economic doctrine in real time. For decades, the Western world believed that financial supremacy was the ultimate weapon. They believed that by flipping a switch, by disconnecting a nation from the global banking system, and by seizing foreign reserves, any adversary could be forced into total domestic collapse. But right now, the largest economic experiment in modern history is failing. And it is not just failing, it is producing the exact opposite of what was intended. If you look at the headlines from 2022, the predictions were unanimous. The Russian economy was supposed to contract by 20%. The ruble was supposed to be reduced to rubble. Inflation was supposed to trigger a total societal revolt. But 3 years later, the data tells a story that should make every investor and taxpayer very uncomfortable. Russian oil exports are currently moving at over 4 million barrels per day. This is happening despite thousands of pages of legal restrictions and the most coordinated sanctions regime ever assembled. Even more shocking is the performance of the Russian currency. While the world was told to expect hyperinflation, the ruble strengthened by 45% against the dollar during its recovery phase and has remained remarkably resilient. This is not just a story about one country or one conflict. This is the first definitive proof that the era of unipolar economic dominance has ended. We are moving into a world where alternatives exist, where financial weapons can be bypassed, and where new trade routes are being carved out of necessity. The systems that were built to enforce order are now accelerating the move toward a multipolar reality. In this video, we are going to analyze why the cost of your life is about to change forever because of this failure. We are going to look at 3 interconnected crises: the failure of energy isolation, the paradox of the strengthening ruble, and the coming commodity war in 2026 that will make the inflation of the past few years look like a minor adjustment. Most importantly, we will see why the very tools used to punish adversaries are now fueling a global resource crunch that you will ultimately pay for. The old rules of the game are gone. The assumptions that guided your financial planning for 30 years are no longer reliable. If you want to understand why your cost of living is rising regardless of what politicians promise, you need to look at the numbers that they are not showing you on the evening news. To understand why the global economic experiment failed, we must look at the physical reality of how energy moves across the planet. The architects of the sanctions regime operated on a 1990s mindset, assuming that because they controlled the banks, the insurance companies, and the major shipping lanes, they could effectively turn off the flow of Russian energy. They underestimated the most powerful force in economics, the profit motive. When a massive gap is created between the price of a commodity and its global demand, the market does not just sit still, it builds a bridge. This bridge is now known as the shadow fleet. Currently, there are hundreds of tankers operating in a legal gray zone, often with obscured ownership and flags of convenience. These vessels do not use Western insurance or Western financing. They have created a parallel logistics network that operates entirely outside the reach of the United States Department of the Treasury. Consider the journey of a single barrel of oil. It leaves a Russian port at a discount of roughly $27 below the global benchmark. On paper, this looks like a victory for the West, as it denies the primary source of revenue for the Russian state. However, as that oil moves toward its destination, something fascinating happens. By the time that same oil reaches refineries in India, that $27 discount has shrunk to less than $8. Where did the other $19 go? It did not disappear. It was captured by a new ecosystem of intermediaries. Much of this money flows into shipping firms, trading houses, and insurance providers that are frequently owned by Russian entities or their strategic partners through complex offshore structures. In essence, the money that was supposed to be drained from the Russian economy is simply being laundered through a global network of middlemen. The biggest winner in this arrangement has been India. Before 2022, India imported almost no Russian oil. Today, they are one of the world's largest buyers. They purchase the crude at a significant discount, process it in their massive, sophisticated refineries, and then sell the finished petroleum products to the very European and American markets that refuse to buy the crude directly. This is arbitrage on a geopolitical scale. Some estimates suggest that India has generated over $16 billion in profit from this trade alone. This capital is not just sitting in bank accounts, it is being used to expand port facilities, build new pipelines, and modernize the Indian energy sector. While the West attempted to use energy as a weapon to isolate an enemy, they inadvertently subsidized the industrial rise of a new global power. This reveals a fundamental flaw in modern economic warfare. In a world where alternative infrastructure exists, sanctions do not stop trade, they merely redirect it. This redirection creates a more expensive, less transparent, and far more resilient system. The global energy market has been permanently restructured, and the cost of this inefficiency is being passed directly to you, the consumer, in the form of higher prices at the pump and increased manufacturing costs. The second pillar of the global economic experiment was the destruction of the Russian currency. The strategy was based on a historical playbook that has worked for decades: trigger a currency collapse, induce hyperinflation, and watch the domestic economy disintegrate from within. In March 2022, when the ruble plummeted to over 130 to the dollar, it seemed the plan was working perfectly. Yet what followed was a series of events that defied every conventional economic forecast. By the middle of 2024 and leading into 2025, the ruble did not just stabilize, it became one of the best performing currencies in the emerging markets sector during its recovery. To understand why this happened, we must look at the shift from a financialized economy to a resource-backed economy. When the West froze $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves, they unintentionally broke the link between the ruble and the Western financial system. Russia was forced to demand payment for its exports in rubles or other non-Western currencies like the Chinese yuan. This created a synthetic demand for the ruble that decoupled it from the speculative volatility of the London and New York markets. But the real paradox lies in how a stronger currency, which usually hurts exporters, actually benefited the Russian structural adaptation. Normally, a strong currency makes a country's exports more expensive and less competitive. However, because Russia was already selling its energy at a massive predetermined discount, the currency strength did not deter buyers like China or India. Instead, the strong ruble provided a massive hidden subsidy for Russian industrialization. A stronger currency meant that the cost of importing machinery, specialized components, and advanced technology from neutral nations became significantly cheaper in ruble terms. While the West focused on restricting consumer luxury goods, Russia used its purchasing power to acquire the industrial inputs necessary to build a self-sufficient domestic manufacturing base. This is the opposite of the intended effect of sanctions. Rather than being starved of resources, the Russian economy was forced to diversify. In 2014, oil and gas revenue accounted for nearly 50% of the Russian federal budget. Today, that number has dropped to approximately 30%. The pressure of isolation forced the state to invest in domestic agriculture, chemical production, and local tech sectors that had been neglected for 20 years. For the global observer, the lesson is clear. Currency warfare only works if the target has no other place to go. By pushing Russia out of the dollar system, the West provided the ultimate incentive for the creation of a parallel financial universe. This movement toward local currency settlement is now spreading to the BRICS nations and beyond. As the demand for dollars to settle international trade decreases, the relative power of the United States to project influence through its currency diminishes. You are seeing the birth of a world where the dollar is no longer the only game in town, and that shift will have profound implications for the value of your savings in the years to come. While the world's attention was fixed on the front lines of geopolitical conflict, the true structural shift was happening across the border in the East. China has become the silent engine driving the failure of the Western economic experiment. This is not merely a trade partnership, it is a fundamental merging of the world's largest resource base with the world's largest industrial workshop. By forcing Russia out of the Western orbit, the sanctions regime effectively gifted China exactly what it needed to challenge American economic hegemony. Guaranteed long-term energy security at a subsidized price. The numbers reflect a massive redirection of global trade. In 2024 and 2025, trade between Moscow and Beijing surged past $240 billion. But the volume of trade is less important than the medium of exchange. For the first time in modern history, a major portion of global energy trade is now settled entirely outside the dollar system. More than 90% of Russian-Chinese trade is now conducted in rubles and Chinese yuan. This is the process of de-dollarization in its most practical, most dangerous form. It is no longer just a theoretical discussion at diplomatic summits. It is a daily reality for thousands of companies. When China buys Russian gas or oil using the yuan, it creates a closed loop. Russia then uses those same yuan to buy Chinese cranes, trucks, microchips, and telecommunications equipment. The American dollar, which for 70 years acted as the mandatory middleman in these transactions, has been completely removed from the equation. This creates a reinforcing cycle for the Chinese currency. As more nations see that it is possible to trade at scale without the dollar, the perceived risk of Western financial retaliation drops. China has built its own version of the SWIFT system, known as the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, or CIPS. In the last 3 years, the participation in this system has grown exponentially. It provides a safety net for any nation that fears its foreign reserves might one day be seized by Western banks. Furthermore, we must look at what China is providing in return. They are not just sending consumer toys or textiles. They are exporting the high-value capital goods that allow a nation to survive a blockade. In 2023 alone, Chinese exports of automobiles and heavy machinery to Russia increased by hundreds of percentage points. By providing the industrial backbone that the West withdrawn, China has ensured that the Russian economy did not just survive, but evolved into a more resilient partner. For you as an observer of the global economy, this represents a tectonic shift. The ability of the United States to print money and export its inflation to the rest of the world depends on the global demand for the dollar. As major powers like China and Russia build a parallel system that functions without the greenback, that global demand begins to erode. This is why the era of low inflation and cheap credit is likely gone for good. You are witnessing the fracturing of the global market into two distinct zones, and the friction between these two systems is what will drive your cost of living higher in 2026. To understand why the global economic experiment failed, we must analyze the historical transition from the 1990s to the present day. We are currently living through the end of what historians call the unipolar moment. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United States and its allies possessed an unprecedented level of economic and financial leverage. During that era, the threat of being cut off from the global financial system was effectively an economic death sentence. In the mid-1990s and even into the early 2000s, if a nation was sanctioned by Washington, it had nowhere else to turn. There were no alternative payment systems, no secondary insurance markets for shipping, and no other industrial powers capable of replacing Western technology. The tools of financial coercion worked because the world was integrated into a single, dollar-denominated architecture. But power, when overused, eventually incentivizes the creation of its own opposition. The decision to freeze $300 billion of Russian sovereign assets in 2022 was the ultimate demonstration of unipolar power, but it also signaled its demise. Central banks around the world, from the Middle East to Southeast Asia, watched as the primary reserve asset of the global system, the United States Treasury bond, was transformed into a political tool. This triggered a fundamental reassessment of risk. If the world's safest asset could be neutralized overnight, then it was no longer truly safe. We are now seeing the results of that realization. In 2024 and 2025, central banks have shifted their reserves into physical gold at rates not seen since the 1960s. This is not just a hedge against inflation, it is a hedge against confiscation. The old tools of coercion are losing their power because the relative balance of global GDP has shifted. In 1990, the G7 nations controlled 66% of global economic output. Today, that share has fallen to approximately 44%. The rise of the BRICS Plus alliance represents a structural alternative that did not exist 20 years ago. When the West blocks a country from the SWIFT system today, that country simply moves its transactions to the Chinese CIPS or the Russian SPFS. When Western insurers refuse to cover tankers, local state-backed insurance entities step in to fill the void. The monopoly on financial services has been broken. This failure of coercion has a direct impact on you. For decades, the United States was able to maintain a high standard of living by issuing debt that the rest of the world was forced to buy. As the effectiveness of financial weapons declines and other nations diversify away from the dollar, the cost of borrowing for the United States government will inevitably rise. This means higher interest rates for your mortgage, your car loans, and your business ventures. The era of the free lunch, where the West could enforce its will without economic consequence at home, is officially over. As we look toward 2026, the focus of global economic competition is shifting from the digital to the physical. While the world has spent the last decade obsessed with software, social media, and the cloud, we have neglected the raw materials that make the modern world function. We are now entering what I believe will be the most consequential commodity war in modern history. And the epicenter of this battle is a single metal: copper. In the 20th century, oil was the lifeblood of global power. Whoever controlled the flow of crude oil controlled the movement of armies and the growth of economies. But in the 21st century, as we transition toward artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, and renewable energy, copper has become the new oil. It is the indispensable conductor of the electrical age. You cannot build a high-density data center, a state-of-the-art power grid, or a fleet of electric vehicles without massive amounts of high-purity copper. The numbers are staggering. In 2025, the global demand for copper has already reached approximately 34 million metric tons. However, by 2035, analysts project that this demand will surge to over 50 million tons annually. We are facing a structural supply deficit that the world has never seen before. To put this in perspective, in the next 10 years, humanity will need to mine as much copper as was produced in the entire 20th century combined. The surge in demand is being driven by two simultaneous revolutions. First, the energy transition. An electric vehicle uses roughly 4 times more copper than a conventional gasoline car, requiring about 85 kilograms per vehicle. Second, and perhaps more urgently, is the artificial intelligence boom. AI is not just lines of code. It is a massive physical infrastructure of servers, cooling systems, and power distribution units. A single gigawatt data center can require over 65,000 tons of copper. As we sit here in late 2025, both the United States and China have reached the same conclusion. Securing copper supply is now a matter of national security. When the world's two largest economies compete for a finite resource, prices do not just rise, they explode. We have already seen copper prices test record highs of over $11,000 per metric ton on the London Metal Exchange. By early 2026, major investment banks like JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs are projecting that supply disruptions and surging demand from the AI sector could push prices toward $12,500 or even higher. For the everyday person, this means that the inflation you experienced in 2021 and 2022 was only the beginning. Copper is the hidden cost inside your housing, your electronics, and your utility bills. When the price of the nervous system of the global economy doubles, every finished product becomes more expensive. We are heading into a decade of resource scarcity, and the copper war is the first sign that the era of cheap, abundant materials is officially over. The battle for copper is not being fought in boardrooms in New York or Beijing. It is being fought on the ground in South America. Chile and Peru together account for nearly 40% of the world's copper production. In 2025, Chile alone produced 5.7 million metric tons, maintaining its position as the undisputed leader. However, the nature of control over this production is shifting. For years, Western mining giants like BHP and Freeport-McMoRan dominated the landscape. But in 2024 and 2025, China has moved with aggressive speed to lock up the future of South American mineral wealth. Chinese state-owned enterprises are no longer just buying copper on the open market. They are buying the mines themselves. We have seen China commit billions of dollars to projects in Peru and Ecuador, often paying premiums of 40% or more over market value. They are not looking for short-term dividends. They are looking for strategic denial. By controlling the source, Beijing ensures that even if global prices spike, their domestic industries, the ones building your next smartphone or electric vehicle, will have a guaranteed supply while the rest of the world scrambles for scraps. The United States has finally woken up to this reality, and the response is a total pivot in industrial policy. Under the current administration in 2025, Washington has begun treating copper and zinc as matters of national defense. A landmark example is the $7.4 billion smelter project in Tennessee, backed by Korea Zinc and the United States government. This is the first major refinery built on American soil since the 1970s. The goal is simple: reshore the processing stage so that America is no longer dependent on Chinese refineries. Currently, China controls approximately 50% of global copper refining capacity. This is a massive strategic choke point. To break this, the United States has implemented a dual-track tariff strategy. Starting in August 2025, a 50% tariff was placed on finished copper products like pipes, wires, and tubes. However, raw copper ore and concentrates remain tariff-free. The message to the global market is crystal clear: bring your raw materials to America, and we will process them here. But building a domestic supply chain from scratch is not cheap, and it is not fast. It takes over a decade to bring a new copper mine from discovery to full production. While the United States subsidizes new smelters and imposes tariffs to protect domestic industry, the immediate result for the consumer is higher costs. By late 2025, American manufacturers are already reporting significant increases in the cost of raw inputs. As the two superpowers outbid each other for the remaining high-grade deposits in the Andes, the global price of copper is being driven into a permanent new plateau. You are watching a bidding war between two titans, and as an everyday consumer, you are the one who will ultimately settle the bill through the rising price of everything that requires a wire to function. If you want to know where the next shock to your cost of living is coming from, look no further than the massive windowless buildings rising on the outskirts of cities from Northern Virginia to Singapore. We are in the middle of a global data center construction boom, fueled by the relentless arms race for artificial intelligence supremacy. But there is a physical reality to AI that the tech giants rarely discuss. It is incredibly copper-intensive. As we move through 2025 and into 2026, the digital world is hitting a very hard, very physical wall. The scale of this demand is unlike anything the commodity markets have ever seen. In a conventional data center used for cloud storage or email, copper is used for basic wiring and power distribution. However, a next-generation AI data center requires exponentially more. According to industry data from late 2025, a single gigawatt-scale AI campus can consume up to 50,000 tons of copper. To put that in perspective, that is the same amount of copper found in roughly 2.2 million conventional gasoline cars or 600,000 electric vehicles. Why does AI need so much metal? It comes down to two factors: power density and cooling. AI chips, like the NVIDIA Blackwell series, operate at much higher temperatures and require far more electricity than traditional servers. To deliver that power safely and efficiently, engineers must use massive copper busbars and heavy-gauge cabling. Each megawatt of data center capacity now requires approximately 27 tons of copper. With tech giants like Microsoft, Google, and Meta planning to bring dozens of gigawatts of new capacity online by 2030, we are looking at a new price-inelastic buyer that will outbid everyone else for every available pound of copper. By December 2025, the cumulative effect of this AI tax on the copper market has become undeniable. Microsoft alone has announced over $80 billion in infrastructure spending, while Meta is tracking toward a $600 billion long-term bet on AI-ready facilities. These companies cannot afford to wait for a mine to open in 10 years. They need the metal now to win the race. This creates a demand shock in a market that was already in a structural deficit. The implications for you are profound. This surge in industrial demand is occurring just as the global electrical grid is being modernized. We are trying to build the AI future, the electric vehicle future, and the renewable energy future all at the same time, using the same limited pool of copper. By 2026, this competition is expected to push global copper demand toward 33 million tons, while mine production struggles to keep pace due to declining ore grades in Chile and Peru. You are not just competing with other drivers for gasoline anymore. You are competing with the world's most powerful tech companies for the very material that makes your modern life possible. When a $3 trillion company needs copper to power its AI, it will pay whatever price is necessary. And you will see that cost reflected in everything from your electricity bill to the price of a new home. Everything we have discussed, the failure of economic sanctions, the restructuring of global trade, and the desperate race for copper, converges at a single point. your personal finances. As we move through the final days of 2025 and into 2026, the era of stable, predictable costs is officially over. You are now paying what I call the geopolitical risk tax, and it is manifesting in three critical areas of your life: housing, consumer goods, and the very stability of your retirement savings. First, let us look at the foundation of the American dream: housing. By late 2025, the cost of building a new home has surged to unprecedented levels. The 50% tariffs on copper, steel, and aluminum implemented throughout this year have added an average of $17,500 to the price of every new single-family home constructed in the United States. This is not just a one-time spike. Construction firms are reporting that the architectural copper used in plumbing and electrical systems is projected to reach $12,500 per metric ton by the second quarter of 2026. When the cost of the nervous system of a house increases by 20% in a single year, developers have no choice but to pass that cost to the buyer or the renter. For the millions of young men trying to enter the housing market, the goalposts are not just moving. They are being accelerated away from you by global resource competition. Second, we must address the silent thief of your purchasing power: structural inflation. While politicians promise that inflation is cooling, the reality in 2026 is a bifurcated economy. While the price of some consumer electronics may fluctuate, any product requiring significant physical inputs, from HVAC systems to automobiles and home appliances, is entering a permanent upward price trajectory. Contractors in October 2025 were already reporting 10 to 20% higher prices for mechanical systems compared to the previous year. As the United States continues to reshore its industrial base and battle China for raw materials, the efficiency of the globalized 1990s is being replaced by the security of the 2020s. Security is expensive. Every time a supply chain is moved or a tariff is applied, you are the one who pays the premium. Finally, we must look at the most dangerous consequence: the debasement of the financial system itself. To fund the hundreds of billions of dollars in AI infrastructure, military modernization, and domestic industrial subsidies, the United States government is running massive fiscal deficits. By mid-2025, long-term Treasury yields jumped above 5% as investors began to question the sustainability of this debt. If the world continues to move away from the dollar, as we saw in the Russian-Chinese trade loop, the demand for American debt will continue to soften. This means that your safe bonds and your 401k are tethered to a system that is being forced to print more money to pay for increasingly expensive resources. In this new environment, the old strategy of buy and hold traditional paper assets may no longer be enough. You are no longer just an investor. You are a participant in a global resource war. Understanding that your cost of living is being driven by these macroeconomic shifts is the first step toward protecting what you have built. The price you pay at the grocery store or the hardware store is not a random occurrence. It is the direct result of a global experiment that failed, and the bill has finally arrived in your mailbox. As we stand on the threshold of 2026, the most important lesson you can take from this failed economic experiment is that adaptability is now the only form of true security. The world of 1995, where one system governed everything and one currency ruled supreme, is gone. It has been replaced by a period of controlled disorder, a multipolar reality where economic weapons are less effective and physical resources are more valuable than paper promises. In this new era, the rules for protecting your wealth and your family's future have fundamentally changed. First, you must move beyond comfortable narratives. If the last 3 years have taught us anything, it is that the data often tells a very different story than the headlines. While the media predicted an imminent Russian collapse, the reality was a structural adaptation that diversified their economy. To survive 2026, you must follow the actual flow of commodities and capital rather than the political rhetoric. Second, recognize that fiscal dominance is the new norm. Governments in the West are now trapped in a cycle of high debt and high interest payments. In the United States, interest on the national debt hit $1 trillion for the first time in fiscal year 2025, making it the second largest federal expense. This means that the government cannot afford for interest rates to stay high forever, nor can they stop spending on critical infrastructure like the copper war and AI development. This environment is structurally inflationary. Holding too much cash or long-term government bonds is no longer a risk-free strategy. It is a guaranteed way to lose purchasing power. Third, focus on real assets. In a world where nations are bidding against each other for copper, lithium, and energy, the things you can touch will hold their value better than the things you can only see on a screen. Strategic diversification into commodities, specialized industrial infrastructure, and even physical gold, which surged past $4,000 an ounce in late 2025, is no longer for preppers. It is for anyone who understands that the global financial architecture is being rewritten. Finally, understand that the unipolar moment is over, but the opportunity moment is just beginning for those who are prepared. The fracturing of the global trade system into distinct blocks, the West versus the BRICS Plus alliance, creates massive inefficiencies, but it also creates massive openings for those who can provide the solutions for reshoring, energy independence, and resource security. The experiment failed because it assumed the world was rigid. It assumed that human ingenuity and the profit motive could be turned off with a legal decree. It was wrong. The world is fluid, and it is moving forward into a system that looks fundamentally different from the one we knew. Stay skeptical of simple stories. Look at the hard numbers of resource production and debt servicing. The future belongs to those who see the patterns early and have the courage to adapt before the rest of the world catches up. Stay safe, stay informed, and I will see you in the next analysis.